and where people have all of these different like interests and perspectives and can actually start working together. So that is, and that is only one example, right? So there's plenty of other examples as well. So if we take, like, let's say, so the concept of this blockchain, like DAO governance in general, right? And there's this question of like, how do we actually create like these DAO-based structures that actually like do something in the in the mainstream somewhere, right? I think obviously a lot of people here are working on DAOs, and I feel like a lot of people here are working on DAO governance. There are plenty of ways of improving DAO governance. So the way that many DAOs are governed today, coin voting. I've written about this many times. Coin voting is just terrible. Now. Okay, wait, I get claps for just saying coin voting is terrible. Coin voting is good? Okay, good. This is, see, okay, maybe I should just like come up with a list of things and come up with a list of judgments and like randomly shuffle them and see what the response is. But okay, if let's see, should we start? Yeah. So like so there's lots of things that we can do to kind of bring improve blockchain. So like for example, if we want to really scale blockchains up, I think sometimes we do have to make some compromises for decentralization and do some data center scaling. Clap for data center scaling. What? No, you're not supposed to clap for data center scaling. No. Okay, so exactly, decentralization, no data centers. Unless, okay. If the data centers are generating ZK snarks and I can verify the ZK snark on my phone, then fine. So speaking of ZK snarks, actually, when we talk about this kind of concept of like blockchain voting, and this is one of those topics that I think is very interesting, and I think it's like one of the natural kind of synergies between like cryptographic technology in general and a lot of the kind of governance ambitions that people have. But in some ways, this is like one of the most challenging things to do well, right? And basically the reason is that, like, on the one hand, I think in general, we do need to have like there is a big opportunity, I think, to add much more of like what I would call kind of like good high bandwidth democracy. And today we have lots of low bandwidth democracy, right? Like you cast a ballot once every 4 years. So low bandwidth, 1 bit of information every 4 years. We have lots of high bandwidth things that are not democracy. We have lots of high bandwidth markets, for example. We also have lots of low security, high bandwidth democracy. Voting on social media, right? Someone makes a tweet, it gets it gets 50,000 likes, 50,000 retweets in 2 minutes. Well, maybe it's actually one guy controlling all of them and it's a bot and you have no idea, right? So the challenge is that there's just like there clearly is this big need for kind of high bandwidth democracy in general, and there are already a lot of these applications that are providing high bandwidth democracy, but they just tend to have very crappy security. And so the question is like, can we have kind of like higher security, high bandwidth democracy? And this is one of those things that I actually think potentially some kind of combination of cryptography and zero-knowledge proofs and encryption actually can provide, right? Like I think you do need all of the technologies. So like you need the encryption to make sure that nobody can see the votes. You need zero-knowledge proofs to make sure that the votes are being counted correctly. You need blockchains to make sure that whoever's counting the votes is not censoring anyone. So you actually do need all of the pieces to come together, right? And you actually can create something with some pretty strong properties. And there are even projects, being kind of homegrown within the Ethereum space that are trying to kind of make things like this possible. But in order to in order for this to really work, like it has to really be done well, right? You know, it has to be efficient, it has to actually be secure, it has to actually be privacy preserving. And in terms of like where to actually accomplish this, I think like I actually feel like focusing on kind of national level votes is almost like the wrong place to start. It's like the last thing you should do instead of the first thing, right? Like I think in general, adding kind of crypto features to existing governments can sometimes the best way to make it work is not to actually like add in like crypto modifications to things that already exist. It's to build completely new things that have better properties that people are going to appreciate because they make it possible to do things that are not possible today. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, this is a big part of why, like, for example, I'm a big fan of quadratic funding, right? And I think quadratic funding is even something that could easily be applied at the government level, right? Like, you know, or at the, you know, state level, at the city level, at many kinds of political levels. There are many kinds of local public goods, and you might, you know, people do have like all sorts of kind of this widely distributed information about like what kinds of these public goods they actually find valuable. And so if we want to actually kind of gather together this kind of information, then, you know, we do want something that's high bandwidth. We do want something where people actually, like, where people can participate at a reasonable frequency. And, you know, we also do want something that's secure, right? So, you know, if we come up with some kind, like some fully decentralized, blockchain-based quadratic funding platform that provides all of the security and the privacy guarantees that a governance system needs to have to be resistant to things like, say, bribery attacks, and this could actually be something really valuable, right? And if something like this gets built, then, you know, potentially it could just get adopted. So now, this, in some ways, like it doesn't, like a lot of this stuff doesn't even need to kind of wait for, you know, big institutions, right? In some ways, like one of the blockchain space all by itself is powerful, right? And the blockchain space all by itself, you know, it can build things, and the blockchain space by itself can do demonstrations. And, you know, even Gitcoin grants by itself, I think, has been just an amazing demonstration. You know, we have like 12 rounds of quadratic funding supporting important public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem. We've had a lot of chances to see like what it looks like, you know, tens of thousands of participants, what kinds of things it's great at, what kinds of things it misses. And it's actually, in my opinion, become like a pretty significant and important tool behind how the Ethereum ecosystem funds things that people in the ecosystem consider important. So that, like, you know, the more experiments and the more the demonstrations like this that you can do, like theoretically, you know, we could just like go and say we are just going to have a Gitcoin grants round for, like, say, businesses in Boulder, for example, right? Like that is something that, you know, the community in Boulder can do. And I think it's interesting, like this kind of like actually like trying to like start materializing kind of like the online the benefits of, you know, the online community into the offline world. I think it's something that we actually can start doing more of. It is something that the crypto space has kind of tried doing repeatedly on a number of occasions, right? So like, for example, back in 2013, you know, when we had Bitcoin, and when, you know, we had Bitcoin payments, and back when cryptocurrency transaction fees were still so low that being cheaper than PayPal was part of the sales pitch. It will be again. But, you know, that's... I should have like come up with some phrase by some famous military leader that had to retreat from a country and promised to return. But, you know, Ethereum with 5-cent transaction fees, we will be back. And yeah. Rollups are already making a huge amount of progress. You know, sharding is already making a huge amount of progress. So, you know, it's not just words. You know, the soldiers are already under development. So, but anyway, like, so back in those days when we did the, when people would actually try to or figure out specific cities and convince or specific districts and convince people in this very large districts to just accept cryptocurrency, or I guess in that case accept Bitcoin, right? Because back then, realistically, Bitcoin maximalism kind of was correct in that every cryptocurrency except for Bitcoin wasn't that interesting back in 2013. But anyway, it actually, in my opinion, it was interesting. It's something that can create local community. So now that scaling technologies actually are on the horizon, it might actually make sense to kind of go back and start doing some more of this, more of that sort of stuff, right? But when we do, that doesn't have to kind of limit itself to just things like convincing stores to accept ETH for payments, right? That could actually mean things like actually, doing quadratic funding rounds, basically saying, hey, we as a community are going to organize, say, a $2 million matching pool, and people can go and actually vote and kind of participate in the quadratic matching, and we can actually see how that goes as an experiment, right? We can actually start doing these things, and if these things are successful, then I think that they're going to be picked up on, right? So quadratic funding is, in my opinion, one of those kind of examples of what I would call high bandwidth democracy that has actually been, it's definitely not perfect for everything, but it has been good at kind of capturing some important niches that existing forms of funding are missing. And so the other question is where do you go beyond? Where do you go from there, right? There's lots of these kind of different pieces of infrastructure that need to happen. There is payments, there is this kind of concept of identity and reputation. And the concept of identity and reputation already has been making a lot of progress, right? I think people think about Ethereum identity in the wrong way, or people think about kind of blockchain ID in the wrong way, right? And what I mean by this is, I believe in blockchain ID, but I do not believe in blockchain ID platforms. So what I mean by this is I think the version of Ethereum-based identity that's going to succeed is the version that is being implemented as we speak, that has been happening over the last few years without anyone actually calling it that. And the people that are trying to do an entire stack themselves, they're basically just creating kind of silos isolated from the ecosystem that are going to fail. So what do I mean by Ethereum identity that we already have? So we have ENS, right? Ethereum, the Ethereum name system. So if you have an Ethereum address, then you can register an ENS name, and you already have something that people can use. You basically have a decentralized username for the Ethereum world. Then we have sign in with Ethereum. So you can use your Ethereum account, whether or not you have an ENS name, to sign into services, including centralized web services. And these two compose with each other. So for example, if you go to chat.blockscan.com, so Etherscan made this lovely chat application that actually accepts sign in with Ethereum. And if you have an Ethereum address, you can sign in, but everyone's going to see your name as 0x blah 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 40 squiggly characters. Now, if instead you have an ENS name, then people are going to actually see your account as being your ENS name as your username, right? So we already see synergies between those two things already. Then we have attestations. So there's proof of humanity attestations. There's just whether or not your account sent a transaction. It's the simplest form of blockchain-based anti-spam you can possibly have. There is, potentially in the future whether or not you're running a validator. There is whether or not you have a pope. There's what kind of pope do you have. So there's this growing ecosystem of attestations about accounts that are happening, right? And this is sort of the Ethereum identity layer that already exists, that's already growing, and that it's open, and it's this kind of growing kind of ecosystem that anyone can take advantage of and anyone can piggyback on. So going back to kind of building the digital state, then one of the questions to ask would be don't really think about it in terms of kind of the state creating its own kind of closed silo system. Actually think about the question of can we design this more digital government infrastructure in a way that it's actually more open and that it actually does kind of talk to, or at least it's able to talk to some of these things that the Ethereum community is building, right? So I guess kind of conclusions from all of this are, right? One is, I think, this kind of really important idea of like, don't think about it in terms of like, what can this specific institution do? Think about it in terms of like, what problem is being solved, and who, like, what are the different groups of people that can work together to actually do it, right? And often, like, you are going to need like different groups of people from different parts of the room to actually work together. This is actually one of the most beautiful things that I've seen about crypto. We just have huge amounts of cross-institutional collaboration that just nobody even recognizes. So, like, for example, zero-knowledge proof protocols. Zero-knowledge proof protocols get frequently designed by and kind of collaborated in, things like Telegram chats and like all sorts of other informal media that like contain some combination of, you have like university scientists, researchers, Ethereum Foundation researchers, Aztec people, Zcash people, and it's just kind of this assorted mishmash of people, and if something needs to be done, they just come together and they do it, right? So we have that for technology. We've had that for many zero-knowledge proof algorithms. We have that more and more for all kinds of things in the Ethereum ecosystem, like ERC-4337, account abstraction, started with a Telegram chat, and there's like people from at least like 4 different organizations that are just coming in and working together and just working on making it happen, right? So like that kind of approach, and like basically seeing like what is the function that you're trying to accomplish, and like who are the people that needs to actually work together and make it happen, and like can we actually make that happen? Like can we actually get people to work together and make it happen? There's a lot of things that I think we can really innovate in. So I think, in some ways, decentralized governance is like kind of one of the big challenges of the 21st century. And I think it's a it's an important challenge even going kind of far outside of the crypto space by itself, right? I think it's like coming up with forms of governance, or even just kind of large-scale social systems in general that satisfy kind of a lot of the properties, including many of the properties that the crypto space is really going after. Like it is something that's really important for many kinds of people, right? So how can we actually make that happen? What kinds of people needs to come together to make this happen? How do we actually make that collaboration happen? Like, what is one particular instance of the problem that we actually can start to get solved? Like, is it, get really trying hard to kind of push quadratic funding and getting quadratic funding out there as something that, just more and more people in all kinds of ecosystems do? That could be an answer. Could there be other kinds of local governance applications? Like, could there be like some kind of micro voting, happening on like street by street zoning or whatever? I don't know. I mean, potentially, if you want something that the community can do by itself, like you could even we don't even have to do binding votes, right? Like you can start with signaling votes. Like I think. The Ethereum ecosystem actually, way back in the good old days, way back when we had more kind of deeply controversial EIPs than we did today, there was this interesting kind of custom where people would do these kind of community and non-binding signaling votes on them. Sometimes there would be coin votes, sometimes there would be like votes with upvotes and downvotes on GitHub, sometimes there would be votes by known community members, and people would just make these votes, and like there would also be non-binding, but they would be internal signals that people could still listen to and determine like whether or not some particular thing that they want to do actually would have consensus, right? So can we do, like, signaling votes might be another sort of application that, like, the community here could start doing, and then over time it could kind of end up growing, and, like, something that is started as a purely kind of advisory and signaling thing could potentially get kind of taken up by existing institutions, and if it works well, then it could just kind of naturally start getting assigned more and more importance, right? So kind of, can you build something that does something now, but does something enough useful now that if it succeeds well enough, then it is in a good position that existing institutions could just decide to kind of assign more and more power and more importance to it, and then it starts scaling up as a new institution from there, right? I mean, think like Glenn Weil talks a lot about kind of what he calls fork and merge governance, and in some ways this is like a similar idea, right? It's like, can you create kind of these institutions that start off being completely fully independent. And if they succeed, kind of the goal is that they just start becoming more and more important. And like, you can't say they replace existing things, because I don't think the goal is like replacing existing things so much as it is creating entirely new things. And maybe the result of creating entirely new things is that existing things stop being important. But that's yeah. Yeah, so maybe start by creating these entirely new things, and then like let's see what happens, right? So that's another thing. And then third piece is like the technology, right? So like we do have to think about like what is the technology that needs to be built to kind of make all of these different things possible. I think scalability is number one, because scalability is always number one. Aside from, of course, the switch to proof of stake. The switch to proof of stake is important, and there are, I think, like a lot of people that do have like these deep concerns about the environmental issues of cryptocurrency as today, and I do think like those concerns are fair, and I think our response to these concerns never has been that those concerns are fake news. I think our response has always been that hey, this is why proof of stake has been part of Ethereum's roadmap almost since the beginning, and this is why finally, after like 7 years of research and development, proof of stake is finally like literally running on working test nets, and it's looking like a month away from a final launch. Yeah. So. Actually, on that topic, I have an interesting suggestion. If you're listening to this and you're from an institution and your and you're really interested in doing something with Ethereum, but you know that you're going to get criticism because people are concerned about environmental issues, then here's what you could do. You could announce that you're interested in launching this crypto integration or this Ethereum integration, but you are going to do it the week after Ethereum does the merge. If the Ethereum merge gets delayed until 2025, you're not going to do it until 2025. If it happens in June, you're going to do it in June, right? Like, just announce that. And so, you're not contributing to the environmental challenge. In fact, you're contributing to the motivation for this community to kind of keep up the good work and finally get the thing over the finish line. So, this is So technology, scalability is important, the proof of stake is important, and also privacy. I think, we don't talk, I feel like I try to talk a lot about blockchain privacy, but blockchain privacy actually is really important. And blockchain privacy is important in actually just like so many different ways. I would probably say one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about privacy in general is that privacy is like either entirely or even primarily a tool for resisting bad institutions. Now, to be clear, I think resisting bad institutions is important. There's plenty of not just governments but also corporations, but also even just public mobs, just like all kinds of actors that do things that they really should not be doing, and people being able to do things privately without kind of broadcasting to the world or broadcasting to the powers that be everything that they're doing as part of their lives is a really important check and balance against that sort of thing. But I think that's not the only function of privacy. The other function of privacy is actually that privacy is often a very necessary part of making institutions that work. Probably the biggest example of this is the secret ballot, right? So everyone's familiar with the secret ballot, right? Like when you vote, like with a paper ballot, the voting is done in such a way that no one can tell where you're no one can tell who you voted for, and you can't prove how you voted, even if you wanted to prove how you voted. So there is a guarantee, the system does try very hard to make it easy to show that the votes are counted correctly, but at the same time, it preserves this privacy, and like it preserves this kind of inability to prove how you participated. And this is really powerful, right? It's really powerful because you can't coerce people to vote in a particular way. You can't coerce people not to vote. You can't buy people's votes. You can't sell your vote. And this is all a really important part in preventing the entire system from basically being captured by concentrated interests that are willing to throw huge amounts of money into buying up everyone's votes. Now, you might be cynical and you might think that like, oh, but they do this anyway, it's called lobbying. But like, no. Like, if you lobby, like, okay, fine, you can like pay people to like go to like blab to politicians and give them nice dinners and like fine, but that's still like there's still this like this much bigger filter. Like, there's a very huge difference between that and like literally actually not even having to come up with arguments that convince people, because your argument is like, hey, if you vote for me, I'm gonna give you $15. Like, by the way, like, okay, like, can I just like do a quick poll? Everyone close your eyes. Secret ballot. Who here would vote for who some stranger on the street tells them to vote if they gave him $15? Okay, see, it's a surprisingly virtuous crowd here. $150. Getting up President Peep. Yeah, okay. So 100, see, so I think, but once those numbers start going up, okay, so this is actually a good point, right? So I think if you make secret ballots if you try to make bribes kind of like as blatant as like, hey, if you vote for this guy, I'm gonna give you $50, then like often you're gonna get lots of people who do resist. But here's what you could have, right? Like, especially in a blockchain context, especially in this kind of digital context where information travels much more freely and much more loosely, then what is going to, like, what you can obfuscate your bribes. So I'm not buying your vote. I'm being a delegate, and as a delegate, I'm offering rewards. As a delegate, I am sharing some of the public goods revenue that I get back to you, the people who support me. See, doesn't that sound like something you want to contribute to? But in reality, it's economically equivalent to bribing, right? So this is like stuff that's already happened in lots of blockchains. So this is a sort of like, so secret ballots are like basically privacy in general. It's like a really powerful tool in just like limiting the damage that these kinds of things can do, right? And privacy in general is just a really powerful and really important like just ingredient in making effective institutions for that reason. Like, I think it's a really powerful ingredient for democracy. It's even a really powerful ingredient for systems of communication, right? Like, I think one of the things that somebody should build is a platform where people can say things anonymously, and they can upvote and downvote things anonymously, but in order to get an account, you have to zero knowledge prove that you're a unique human. So like you have to zero knowledge proof that you have a particular proof of humanity profile, and only then can you participate, and only then do you get one vote, right? So you get the privacy benefits of anonymity, but you know that if something has 300 upvotes, it was supported by 300 unique people, and not some bot that just created 300 fake accounts. So, this is one of the nice things that we can do with this technology. It's powerful. These are powerful tools, right? Look, we could get very strong privacy and very strong safety and authenticity gains at the same time. And, lots of people here in the room are, I think, a big part of like making this kind of technology possible. So, technology can make a big difference. Existing institutions, things like the Wyoming bill, and things like some of the kind of support to projects like Citicoins that they've given, I think can be very helpful and very important. And yay, okay. By the way, is there anyone here from somewhere other than Colorado or Wyoming? Okay, cool, yeah. So is anyone here part of a DAO of any of those regions? Okay, cool, yeah, see, so we need Texas DAOs, right? So this is, yay, Texas DAO. No, see, this is good, right? Like, it gets, see, the question isn't like, maybe the answer to how do we cryptoify it, like, say, Texas, isn't how do we, like, convince the Texas state governments to add more things one by one. Maybe the solution is, like, let's do Texas DAO, and then Texas DAO starts off being this kind of thing that's just a bunch of volunteers, and that just wants to, like, do local community projects, and then more and more people join, and then it just becomes more and more powerful organically on its own. Maybe that is the solution, right? So, like, both of those solutions exist. Like, you can basically convince the big thing to improve incrementally, or you can go incrementally by making a very pure small thing and having it grow over time. And both of those paths are good, and sometimes those paths even need to work together. So basically, you know, those are kind of the takeaways. Like, try and think through, like, what actually is the path toward making something with a large-scale impact. Don't just think about, like, what specific, like, how to reform one specific institution. Think about, like, maybe the solution does actually involve, like, people from 3 different groups coming together. Maybe the solution involves people from, like, 20 different groups coming together. And I think, like, that kind of work is actually how we're going to kind of get somewhere close to this kind of, like, you know, I guess, you know, DAO-based solar punk world where, you know, everything is happy and the buffercorns can dance and the buffercorns can accept Cardano. So, yeah, okay, yay, questions. Yeah.
If you have a question, you can come down and get in line, and we'll take them just for about 7 minutes, maybe. 10 minutes. Yeah. 10 minutes, please.
So, hold on 1 second.
Yeah, no, so, like, privacy is important, right? I talk about privacy.
The back line, please. Hold on. Here you go. Hold on.
Okay.
Wow. Yeah. You guys all right? All right?
Okay, that's good.
Whew.
Yeah.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Love the pants, by the way. Aren't those pants hot, right? Let's get a round of applause. Dope. Yeah, my name is Tony. I'm from North Carolina. I got a question I think a lot of people want to ask. How do you feel about Solana?
I don't know, Solana's cool. It seems sunny. Cool.
Hey, Vitalik. My name is Brecken Hager. I actually started the Texas DAO with a few lawyers here. It'll be legally recognized as the second DAO in America next week. My first question is, do you believe in God?
What is God? It depends.
Depends? Okay. And then the second question is, throughout history and with decentralization, especially mass decentralization, one great centralization is inevitable. How can Ethereum and how can you make sure that this doesn't become a one world, you know, government?
So I guess, like, how to make sure that Ethereum doesn't, like, itself turn into some kind of, like, centralized pool that, like, actually, like, controls things. And yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an important question. I think the biggest defense that we have against that isn't even a technical defense. The biggest defense is, like, what kind of community that we have. And I think the biggest virtue that I think the community has that I want to see cultivated even more, basically is the diversity that it has. And, like, I mean the diversity in, like, a very broad sense, right? Like, you know, we have people interested in, like, focused on technology. We have people in institutions. We have people in Texas. You know, we have people in kind of far corners of the world that are very outside of the U.S. We have people that are, like, interested in Ethereum in order to accomplish different things. And so my hope is that as long as the community kind of keeps this the pluralist spirit that it currently has, and that by itself can be a defense against, like, either, you know, the Ethereum blockchain or kind of things that are closely attached to it from kind of turning into tools that kind of get used to control people and impose bad outcomes. I mean,
like data part. Specifically speaking, my biggest concern with when I read the Ethereum white paper in 9th grade, it changed my life. But now with data partitioning around the corner. Oh, sorry. Forgive me. Don't data or religious freedom. That's all I ask.
Thanks.
I support
Short and
religious
sweet.
freedom.
So many members of the community are advocating right now for going full KYC and AML for promoting the adoption of the masses and the institutions. What would your message to this sector of the community be?
I mean, I think the message is that, like, one is just like privacy is important, and another is that inclusion is important. And I think the biggest kind of like inclusion that things like forcing KYC and AML into more layers of the ecosystem prevent actually is like it basically forces the system to discriminate much more by nationality. Right, because it basically creates systems where, you know, if you're in the US and you have all of your US infrastructure, then you can participate easily. But then if you are in some other country, then potentially, you know, your entire country might get labeled a money laundering risk, and then suddenly, like, you basically, just because of where you were born, like, you have a much harder time participating. And like that sort of stuff really, you know, goes against what I think are a lot of the kind of core benefits that the blockchain space is trying to accomplish. So I would say that, you know, KYC and AML at the level of exchanges and at the level of like centralized these infrastructure providers that are kind of like serving as, you know, bridges from crypto to the rest of the space. Like that's fine and that's legally unavoidable in any case. But I think, you know, it is really important, especially for things really close to the core of the space, to like still have that kind of like this kind of full level of like both openness, compatibility with people's ability to preserve privacy and all these values. Because like if the base layer doesn't have those things, then nothing built on top of it possibly can. Yeah.
Hey Vitalik, my name's Oliver. There's a quote I think about a lot, and I can't tell if it's true. It says that society is downstream of technology. And I think you're uniquely qualified to give an opinion on this. Do you see society as more shaped by technology as a force that inevitably moves forward? Or do you think we can pick our areas to innovate in places that are more likely to shape society in the way we want it to?
I think society can be shaped by technology, but I think technology can also be shaped by culture. I could even give like very specific examples of this. So like one very subtle one is like, let's take like say Sci-Hub, for example, right? Like so Sci-Hub, you know, this like online website where anyone can go and download scientific papers, and like the whole thing is totally copyright infringing, right? And like in many cases, and like it lets people get this stuff for free, despite the fact that the paper, like, you know, there's this university publisher kind of like infrastructure that and copyright and all of this that really doesn't want you to. So this exists for science papers, and it's very easy to use for science papers, but it exists less effectively for, say, music, for example, right? And one of the reasons why I think it exists like the tools for doing this for scientific papers are so much stronger than the tools for doing this for music is because there is an even stronger social consensus that like scientific papers really should all be open access and free. And in reality, you know, there isn't there isn't a good argument that like, oh, this should be restricted because the scientists need to be paid, because like, well, realistically, like we know that there is plenty of there are plenty of ways of paying them, and like often the revenue collected by this kind of university system doesn't end up actually all like going to support research that much, right? And like, you know, people can make those arguments for like say music as well, and you know, people like the pirate parties have, but like it is, I think, in general, people believe that like the case is significantly stronger for scientific papers, and so as a result of like these moral views that people have, like the technology for the tools for making scientific papers open access, like basically by force, like it is just much easier and much more developed, right? So like that's one tiny example of how like even just moral views that people have end up influencing like what specific kinds of in this case like basically copy protection, evasion technology, but it could also be censorship resistant technology, it could also be technology in general that people spend their time working on. And I think that's true in ends up being true much more broadly. So, the more people value privacy, the more there are going to be smart people working on making zero-knowledge proofs and encryption work much better and much easier to use. The more people value, say, the more people value doing things having a better life in on the internet, the more there will be software developed to try to make better forms of virtual reality, better ways for us to interact online. Meanwhile, the more people value improving the physical world, the more we're going to see all sorts of new kinds of advanced forms of transportation. The more we're going to see supersonic jets. The more we're going to see better ways of building buildings and all of this stuff, right? And the rate at which those different trajectories can progress, I think it does depend on the kinds of values that people have. So I do think that technology definitely has big influences on society. Technology has big influences on norms, but I think that culture has big influences on the technology that gets built as well. And I do think that eventually everything is going to get invented, but I think the order in which things get invented does matter, right? And especially if it's technologies that have to do with things like privacy, where we're basically talking about giving the little guy the ability to kind of resist the big or basically some kind of defense against the big guy trying to snoop on everyone and see what everyone is doing, right? In that case, it's not even a matter of how fast everything gets developed. It is a matter of well, is this side of the technology being developed faster, or is this side of the technology being developed faster? And I think, if we have a culture that values privacy, then the technology that creates more privacy will actually develop faster than the technology that breaks privacy. And in my own opinion, that is a good thing. So, answer yes, culture matters.
Thank you.
Yeah, culture matters.
Hi, Vitalik.
Hi.
I had one question. What is one use case of blockchains that you think is overhyped right now? And what is one use case that you think is neglected and we should focus more on?
I mean, neglected and we should focus more on, I think, is the intersection of blockchains and zero-knowledge proofs. People focus on it a lot, but I still think that people don't focus on it enough. In terms of something that is overhyped, I mean, I'll give the boring answer, which is governance tokens. I think people still do governance tokens too much. I think people should do more of governance using any way that's not a token, just so we can experiment with new models and see what happens.
Perfect, thank you. And where'd you get those trousers from?
A friend bought them for me as a gift. So, yeah.
Hey Vitalik, my name is Brian. Thanks for existing, by the way. Earlier today on this stage, a lady from the Polkadot ecosystem was asked the interesting question of what is something that Ethereans can learn from Polkadot. Her answer was, look at what they're doing with Kusama. Instead of having a bunch of test nets, have a live in production with real value, move fast, break things, and canter in the coal mine. Is that a bad idea?
I would definitely support that. I mean, I definitely think that having something that's kind of between a testnet and a mainnet that has some economic incentives definitely could be valuable. I mean, I think in general we actually need to be bolder with our testnets. Where is the Ethereum proof of stake testnet that has a 1 second slot time? Where is the Ethereum testnet that has a 140 million gas limit just so we can see what happens? I think we do having more and different kinds of test nets, and including test nets that have more of that have kind of enough realness to test economic properties and not just technical ones, definitely something that I really support.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vitalik.
We're out of time, dude.
Okay.
Unless, I mean, you can stick around and do Q&A all night if you want.
I'll answer one last one.
All right. It's up to him.
I like the Walk Me hat, by the way. It's
One
great.
thing I just want to say before we answer the final question, because it's going to get scattered, we have the fire marshal here who's concerned about our exodus. So please do so calmly. We have the door through the other stage here, the infinity stage, that's actually open to the garage. So there's actually 2 equal exits. So thank you for coming. Vitalik, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So I'm very interested in what you said about attestations. Other than proof of humanity, what do you think are the main building blocks still missing in that space, and how is that space going to evolve?
Okay, one of the things that I'm excited about is like this concept of like either like proof of participation or even like proof of learning, proof of having particular skills. So one of the places where this can be important is airdrops, but like I feel like airdrops are the sort of thing where like initially everyone really loved them, right? Like because there was the Uniswap airdrop, which in the middle of the darkest days of the coronavirus just kind of like stood up and said, hey guys, everyone who ever used Uniswap got this lovely $1,400 stimulus check. And I think that was amazing, but obviously since then, people have started gaming the airdrops, people have started like farming addresses, and there's professional VC farms that farm addresses and all this stuff. So if you want to improve airdrops, so from that perspective, then we make them proof of humanity gated, right? Like you need to have an account that actually has a proof of humanity profile. By the way, ideally, whenever I talk about this stuff, assume that this stuff should have like some zero knowledge layer in between to protect privacy. It always should. But that only solves part of the problem, right? The other part of the problem with airdrops is that I think project teams themselves are increasingly unhappy with them. And the reason why they're unhappy with them is that you're basically, spewing out large numbers of tokens to an undifferentiated mass of people without much regard for how much each of those people actually cares about your project. What you want to do is you want to distribute tokens to people who care. So this is where I think what would be ideal is, if you learn something about a project, you get some number of tokens. If you perform some unit of work for a project, you get some number of tokens. If you help a project translate a page, you get some number of tokens. And ideally, this would be done to basically give people a kind of like an on-ramp where people, while they are earning tokens, they would also actually be kind of like becoming more helping to understand the ecosystem, the project that they're participating in, and even be an on-ramp to eventually be having enough skills to be full-time contributors, right? So you're satisfying the function of being an airdrop and redistributing the tokens, and so it's okay if you're paying people $45 to do something that if you really wanted to, you could do much more cheaply, because the goal is you're paying $45 for people to potentially become a new user of this project and become much more useful way down the line, right? So if we want things like that to happen, then some version of Pope that proves that you did some particular thing, proves that you pass through some exercise that involves learning about how a project works, that proves that you just performed some kind of tasks inside of a project, that sort of stuff. The more infrastructure like that we have, then one of the nice things that we can get as a result is we can have better airdrops. And I mean, people have started to talk about digital states. So to start off, the way that I tend to think about these things is that new institutions are never going to be exact carbon copies of old ones, right? They're never going to be a better version of something that fits into the exact same box, right? So, when you have cars, cars don't perfectly replace horses. There's things that horses can do that cars don't do. There's things that cars do that horses don't do. There's a lot of differences between them. And when we talk about even the internet replacing telephones, or the internet replacing some aspects of in-person communication, right? It's not about creating a new thing that is that is like the old thing, except it's just better because you add this piece of magic pixie dust, and one particular aspect of it becomes 37% better for whatever reason. It often does end up changing how we actually relate to what fundamental problems that we're trying to solve, right? So when we talk about the digital state, I even find it less interesting to ask the question of, say, what can city governments do to become more digital, or what can national governments do to become more digital, or how can we coordinate 10,000 people to go to the same location in the middle of a desert in Nevada, and hopefully actually create a new city with fancy blockchain quadratic stuff that actually works well. All of those questions are interesting, but prefer to kind of step back and just think about this from the point of view of what are we trying to accomplish, and why are we even having this conversation, and what are the tools that we have, and how do we kind of start to narrow the gap between the tools and the results, right? So I think the most fascinating thing about at least this particular Ethereum community is that it just has this lovely combination of a whole bunch of very positive cultures that I like, right? So the first very positive culture aspect that I like is just the fact that this is a culture that is very interested in ideas like creating new institutions, creating new ways for people to cooperate, creating new governance structures, even creating new communication structures, thinking about relationships between communication and governance, and actually using things like blockchains and cryptography and incentives and tools and putting them together into these different arrangements where hopefully we'll build something that allows us to work together on something better in some way. So that's the first thing that I like. The second thing that I like is there is I think very cooperative aspects to the community. Everyone here is working together. Everyone here is kind of aligned on this many different visions, but still fairly aligned visions on just how to actually turn all of this into some kind of a better world. And we even see a lot of very positive interactions between the crypto community and institutions, right? So the governor, Jared Polis, spoke here. There's plenty of other people from local government, from many other institutions that are here. What was that? Wyoming DAO, yay, Wyoming is, okay. Yeah, no, I was going to mention, I think the Wyoming DAO law is actually great, and it's one of the, in my opinion, the Wyoming DAO law actually is one of the best examples so far of governments doing something, something that goes beyond just not breaking the industry, that is actually really helpful to the crypto space's ability to thrive, right? Because what it basically is it's government passes a law and it basically gives DAOs this new superpower, right? They can incorporate and they can now legally own property, and they can actually legally do things and act as legal entities. That's probably one of the most powerful kind of bridges between the crypto world and the traditional world that we have, right? And so because of that, things like CityDAO can exist. Because of that, plenty of other projects can exist, right? So that's amazing. So I guess, okay, in Colorado and in Wyoming, there seems to be this lovely spirit of collaboration between the crypto community and government and many other kinds of institutions. So this is good, right? And so then the question is, well, okay, so there's people in the crypto community and there's people in existing institutions that are interested in these goals of using these new technologies to help people cooperate better, to create more open, more free, and more fair, more transparent forms of cooperation. And how do we actually take that energy and what kinds of specific things can we work on in order to actually start to get closer to those kinds of outcomes? Now, the reason why I kind of phrase things in this way is that it doesn't matter as much who does it, right? So for example, if the state of Colorado does something that enables some kind of crypto support across the state, it doesn't matter which, then that's one way of doing it. But what if instead the state of Colorado creates some kind of law that makes it easier for independent groups to whether it's DAOs, whether it's local governments, whether it's something else, to basically work together themselves to achieve that same outcome, and you end up having the same result, right? So sometimes I think like there is this solution of like taking existing institutions and kind of pushing them in this direction. And then sometimes there's this approach of this kind of more bottom-up approach, right? Where you start with a small scale, but something that's kind of purely crypto and purely digital. And you do some experiments, and some of those experiments fail, some of those work, and you scale it up from there. And these two paths are not opposing, right? Like sometimes people think of these two paths are not as opposing. I don't actually think that they are opposing. I actually think that often they can complement each other. So often Wyoming DAO law is excellent example there, right? Institutions can do something where once they do it, the institution doesn't need to do anything else, and it actually creates space for the bottom-up community to do all of this work and actually make all of the amazing progress happen, right? So I think that's like one definitely great path to take. Other paths to take would be obviously starting from the institution and then kind of adding pieces on top, right? So at the end of last year, I wrote this article on city coins. And city coins are this kind of concept that people have been starting to think about. And like, there's this idea of, can we create coins that are attached to cities somehow, and could potentially introducing city coins actually like fix incentives and improve local governance. And there are some interesting things that you can do there, right? So like, how can you create economic alignments between people in a city and the whole city? Like, I think the traditional way of doing this tends to be about encouraging like basically property ownership and land ownership, and everyone must own a house. And if you don't own a house and you love your avocado toast, you're a bad person. I love my avocado toasts. But the reality is that like houses are non-fungible. Houses are, you're either a renter and you're negatively exposed to your community, or you're a buyer and you're just massively overexposed to your community. And the reality is that they're both irresponsible. Houses are they do not create economic alignment with the entire city. They create economic alignment with a very small portion of a city, and often in ways that create conflict with the rest of the city, right? So, people often are like, hey, we want more development, we want more great stuff, but like not in my backyard, right? So, the idea of like, can we create cities that have more economic alignment inside them, and can we come up with techniques other than like individuals owning specific pieces of property? I think it's a really good idea, and it's an idea that like we don't know exactly the correct way to implement that idea, but there's room for a lot of good experiments, I guess this category of city coins would be one thing that we call those experiments. So so city coins are just like one example of like a thing that can be done. But then there is the question of like who does it, right? And here again, this is there can actually be a lot of different answers, right? So like Miami Coin, for example, is like this interesting project on one end of the spectrum where they basically say like, okay, this is basically just a community project, and it starts as a community project, and it doesn't have any kind of direct connection to the city government. Like you don't actually have like city-defined legal rights as a result of it, but it's gotten some support from the government, and maybe over time the coin's role might change. Who knows? So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it would be like for the city itself to actually create the coin. So which of those approaches you take? Could you take some approach in between? It depends on the situation. But in general, like if you are a city government and we want something like that to exist, then like both of those routes do exist, right? Like one of the things that you can do is you can do it yourself, and one of the things that you can do is you can create the environment that makes it possible for other people in the community to like basically do all of the work for you, right? Because there are lots of people in the community, and there are lots of people that are very willing and very excited to do these kinds of interesting things and really empower people. But like in order for that to happen, you actually do need to like somehow create a framework that is supportive of them. there are frameworks that are supportive of people. There are frameworks that are kind of like actively, I guess, anti-supportive of people, right? So, legal frameworks that, for example, make it easier to launch a token the less your token promises people. Like, in some ways, that's actively anti-supportive, right? And like coming up with structures that are better and coming up with, like, say, ways to for people to launch tokens where you actually have like that are more friendly to the project, the more aligned its incentives are. This is like the sort of thing where we do need kind of lots of people to work together to actually make it happen, and it is the sort of thing that like it's great that we actually have kind of lots of different kinds of people all in a room, and where people have all of these different like interests and perspectives and can actually start working together. So that is, and that is only one example, right? So there's plenty of other examples as well. So if we take, like, let's say, so the concept of this blockchain, like DAO governance in general, right? And there's this question of like, how do we actually create like these DAO-based structures that actually like do something in the mainstream somewhere, right? I think obviously a lot of people here are working on DAOs, and I feel like a lot of people here are working on DAO governance. There are plenty of ways of improving DAO governance. So the way that many DAOs are governed today, coin voting. I've written about this many times. Coin voting is just terrible. Now. Okay, wait, I get claps for just saying coin voting is terrible. Coin voting is good? Okay, good. This is, see, okay, maybe I should just like come up with a list of things and come up with a list of judgments and like randomly shuffle them and see what the response is. But okay, if let's see, should we start? Yeah. So like so there's lots of things that we can do to kind of improve blockchains. So like for example, if we want to really scale blockchains up, I think sometimes we do have to make some compromises for decentralization and do some data center scaling. Clap for data center scaling. What? No, you're not supposed to clap for data center scaling. No. Okay, so yeah, exactly, decentralization, no data centers. Unless, okay. If the data centers are generating ZK snarks and I can verify the ZK snark on my phone, then fine. So speaking of ZK snarks, actually, when we talk about this kind of concept of like blockchain voting, and this is one of those topics that I think is very interesting, and I think it's like one of the natural kind of synergies between like cryptographic technology in general and a lot of the kind of governance ambitions that people have. But in some ways, this is like one of the most challenging things to do well, right? And basically the reason is that, like, on the one hand, I think in general we do need to have like